Good evening. Tonight, we're witnessing what could be the end of an era. The NATO alliance, the most powerful military coalition in human history, is facing an existential crisis. And the threat isn't coming from Moscow, it isn't coming from Beijing, it's coming from Washington. President Donald Trump has just delivered an ultimatum that has European capitals in absolute chaos. His message to America's oldest allies? Crystal clear. Pay up, or you're on your own. This isn't diplomatic pressure. This isn't negotiation. This is the President of the United States threatening to dismantle 75 years of Western unity. And the consequences? They could reshape the entire global order. Let's start with what happened. Because the speed of this crisis has been absolutely breathtaking. It began within hours of Trump's inauguration on January 20th. While European leaders were still drafting their congratulatory messages, Trump was already on the attack. At a private dinner with Republican senators, he made his position clear. NATO is ripping off the United States. Europe is freeloading, and it ends now. Then came the public statements, one after another, each more provocative than the last. Trump called NATO obsolete. He said most members are delinquent on their payments. He suggested America might not defend countries that don't meet his spending demands. And then, in the statement that sent shockwaves around the world, he told reporters, if they're not going to pay, we're not going to protect them. It's very simple. Now, before we go further, we need to understand what NATO actually is. Because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and Trump himself has mischaracterized how the alliance works. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded in 1949. World War II had just ended. Europe was in ruins. And Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union was expanding aggressively across Eastern Europe. The fear was real. The threat was existential. So 12 nations came together with a simple promise. An attack on one is an attack on all. That principle, enshrined in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, meant that if the Soviet Union invaded France or Belgium or any member state, it would be at war with all of them, including the United States. It was deterrence through collective security, and it worked. For 75 years, no NATO member has ever been invaded by a foreign power. Not once. That's not an accident. That's the longest period of major power peace in European history. But here's where Trump's argument begins. And to be fair to the president, he's not entirely wrong about the underlying issue. NATO doesn't have membership dues. That's a misconception. Countries don't write checks to NATO headquarters. What NATO does have is a spending guideline. In 2014, after Russia's invasion of Crimea, NATO members agreed to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense by 2024. 2%, that was the deal, that was the commitment. So where do we stand today, in 2025? Out of 32 NATO members, only 11 meet that target. 11. That's barely 1/3 of the alliance. Let's look at the numbers. The United States spends approximately 3.4% of GDP on defense. That's roughly $900 billion annually. Poland, sitting right on Russia's border and understandably terrified, spends 4%. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're spending between 2.5 and 3%. They know what Russian occupation looks like. They lived it for 50 years. But then look at the rest of Europe. Germany, the economic powerhouse of the continent, spends just 1.5%. France is at 1.9%. Italy, 1.5%. Spain, 1.3%. Canada, America's neighbor and supposedly closest ally, is at 1.3%. So Trump looks at this and says, why is America subsidizing Europe's defense? Why are we spending $900 billion while Germany spends a fraction of that? Why should American taxpayers pay for European security when Europeans themselves won't? And you know what? Millions of Americans agree with him. This isn't just Trump. This frustration has been building for decades. American soldiers are stationed across Europe. American equipment, American intelligence, American nuclear umbrella, all protecting a continent that, in Trump's view, takes American protection for granted while criticizing American foreign policy. Trump's supporters say Europe has gotten comfortable. They've outsourced their defense to Washington while spending their money on universal health care, free university education, generous pensions. Meanwhile, America goes trillions into debt maintaining a global military presence. But now here's where Trump's argument gets dangerous. Because he's not just demanding more European spending. He's threatening the fundamental principle that holds NATO together. Article 5 has only been invoked once in NATO's history. Not after a Soviet attack, not after a Russian invasion, after 9/11. When America was attacked, every NATO ally answered the call. British soldiers fought in Afghanistan, so did Germans, French, Italians, Canadians. Over 1,000 non-American NATO troops died in that war, fighting America's war. And now, Trump is suggesting that if Estonia or Latvia gets invaded, America might not show up. This is what has European leaders absolutely terrified. Because Trump isn't just negotiating, he's fundamentally questioning whether the alliance exists at all. Let's talk about what Trump specifically demanded. Because the ultimatum is even more extreme than most people realize. Trump wants NATO members to spend 3% of GDP on defense. Immediately, not 2% by some future date. 3%. Now. For context, that would require countries like Germany to double their defense budgets overnight. We're talking about finding an additional 80 to 100 billion euros every single year. Where does that money come from? German hospitals? Schools? Infrastructure? Germany's government is already running deficits. Their economy is barely growing. And Trump wants them to find 100 billion euros for tanks and missiles? It's the same across Europe. Italy's economy is stagnant. Spain has massive unemployment. France is dealing with social unrest. These aren't wealthy oil states sitting on cash reserves. These are complex economies with aging populations, expensive social programs, and limited fiscal flexibility. But Trump doesn't care about Europe's domestic challenges. He's given them a deadline. And he's made it clear, if you don't comply, you're not under America's protection anymore. Now, let's be very clear about what that means in practice. There are approximately 100,000 American troops stationed in Europe right now. American bases in Germany, Italy, the UK, Poland, Romania, the Baltics. American fighter jets, American missile defense systems, American intelligence sharing. All of that could disappear. Trump has already floated the idea of withdrawing American forces if countries don't pay up. Imagine you're the president of Estonia. Your country has 1.3 million people. Your military has about 7,000 active soldiers. Across your border is Russia, with over 1 million active military personnel, thousands of tanks, nuclear weapons, and a leader who has openly questioned your right to exist as an independent nation. The only thing standing between you and a Russian invasion is Article 5. The promise that America will fight for you. And now Donald Trump is saying that promise might be negotiable. Can you imagine the fear in Tallinn right now? In Riga? In Vilnius? These are countries that were occupied by the Soviet Union for 50 years. They remember the deportations, the gulags, the systematic destruction of their cultures. They joined NATO specifically to prevent that from ever happening again. And now the guarantor of their security is wavering. Polish officials are publicly panicking. Poland has already announced they'll hit 4% defense spending. They're buying American weapons as fast as they can. Why? Because they know their history. In 1939, Britain and France promised to defend Poland against Nazi Germany. Those promises were worthless. Poland was conquered in weeks. Warsaw will do whatever it takes to keep American troops on Polish soil. Because they know, without America, they're vulnerable. And this brings us to the elephant in the room. The reason this crisis is happening right now. Ukraine. For nearly 3 years, Ukraine has been fighting a brutal war against Russian invasion. Hundreds of thousands dead. Cities reduced to rubble. And slowly, agonizingly, Russia is gaining ground. Trump has promised to end the war in 24 hours. His plan, as far as anyone can tell, involves forcing Ukraine to give up territory to Russia in exchange for peace. Crimea stays Russian. The Donbass stays Russian. Ukraine promises never to join NATO. European leaders are horrified by this prospect. Because if Trump rewards Russian aggression in Ukraine, what message does that send to Putin about the Baltics, about Moldova, about Poland? And here's the nightmare scenario that keeps European defense ministers awake at night. What if Trump withdraws from NATO, forces Ukraine to surrender, and then Russia invades a NATO member state? Without American leadership, without American military power, could Europe actually stop a Russian offensive? Let's wargame this out. It's uncomfortable, but necessary. Imagine it's 2026. Trump has pulled most American forces out of Europe. Article 5 is effectively dead, even if not officially revoked. And Russia decides to test NATO's resolve. A little green men scenario in Estonia, just like Crimea in 2014. Russian-speaking separatists in eastern Estonia suddenly rebel. Russia sends volunteers to help them, then peacekeepers. Before anyone can react, Russian forces control a quarter of Estonian territory. Estonia invokes Article 5. They demand NATO intervention. What happens next? France and the UK have nuclear weapons, but are they really going to risk Paris or London over Tallinn? Germany has a powerful economy, but their military is notoriously underfunded and poorly equipped. A German parliamentary report in 2018 found that zero of Germany's submarines were operational. None of their tanks could fire properly. This is the military that's supposed to stop Russia. Without American power, American air superiority, American logistics, American intelligence, American nuclear deterrence, European NATO is a hollow shell, and Putin knows it. This is why Trump's ultimatum is so catastrophic. He's not just demanding more money, he's destroying the credibility of the alliance itself. Deterrence only works if your adversary believes you'll actually fight. The entire point of NATO is that Russia knows attacking a member state means war with the United States. That's what keeps the peace. But when the American president publicly questions whether he'd defend allies, that deterrence evaporates. Putin can start calculating. Maybe America won't respond. Maybe Trump will negotiate instead of fight. Maybe this is the moment to move. Intelligence analysts are already seeing increased Russian military activity near NATO borders. Exercises, movements, probing, testing. Now let's talk about what Trump gets wrong, because his transactional view of NATO misses the bigger strategic picture. Trump sees NATO as a protection racket, pay up or lose protection, but that's not how alliances work, and it's definitely not how global power works. American bases in Europe aren't charity, they're power projection. Ramstein Air Base in Germany is how America conducts operations across the Middle East and Africa. American forces in Poland are a forward defense against Russia. American presence in the Mediterranean controls one of the world's most strategic waterways. These bases make America powerful. They allow the U.S. military to operate globally. Without them, American power shrinks dramatically. And economically, NATO allies buy American weapons. Billions of dollars in F-35 fighters, Patriot missiles, Apache helicopters. That's jobs in American factories. That's American defense contractors getting rich. NATO standardization means European militaries use American equipment, American technology, American systems. That creates dependencies that benefit American industry enormously. There's also the intelligence sharing aspect that Trump seemingly doesn't value. The Five Eyes Alliance, US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, is the most sophisticated intelligence network in human history. But it extends into NATO. British intelligence operations, French human intelligence networks in Africa, German signals intelligence, Polish intelligence on Russia, all of this flows to Washington. America gets more intelligence from its allies than it could ever collect alone. Walk away from NATO, and that stops. Suddenly America is blind in regions where it desperately needs visibility. So how is Europe responding to Trump's ultimatum? With panic, defiance, and a desperate scramble for alternatives. Emmanuel Macron in France has been the most vocal. He's calling for European strategic autonomy. Translation: Europe can no longer depend on America. Europe needs its own military capability, independent of NATO. Macron has proposed a European army, a unified command structure, joint procurement, shared nuclear deterrence under French weapons. Germany is having an identity crisis. For 80 years, German foreign policy has been built on three pillars: European integration, transatlantic alliance, and never again remilitarizing. Trump is forcing Germany to choose between the second and third pillars. There are voices in Berlin now openly discussing rearmament, major rearmament, bringing back conscription, developing a German nuclear program, things that were absolutely unthinkable 5 years ago. The UK is caught in the middle. Post-Brexit Britain needs American support but also can't afford to alienate Europe. British defense officials are quietly trying to play mediator, to calm things down, to find a compromise. But here's the problem with the European army solution. It doesn't exist, and it won't exist for decades. Building a military from scratch takes an enormous amount of time and money. You need to develop command structures, training programs, logistics networks, defense industries. You need soldiers, officers, equipment, bases, supply chains. France and the UK have serious militaries, but they're not large enough to defend all of Europe. Germany's military is a mess. Italy's military is small. Spain's military is underfunded. Even if Europe committed to building a unified force, it would take 20 years minimum, and tens of trillions of euros. Putin isn't going to wait 20 years. And this brings us to the most terrifying question of all. The question nobody wants to ask out loud but everyone is thinking. What is Trump actually trying to achieve here? Is this negotiation an aggressive tactic to force Europe to spend more, after which Trump will back down and reaffirm Article 5? Or is this genuine? Does Trump actually want to withdraw from NATO, to end America's role as guarantor of European security? And if it's the latter, why? Some analysts believe Trump genuinely sees NATO as a bad deal for America, that he wants to pull back from global commitments and focus on America first. Others see something darker. They point to Trump's consistent pattern of praising autocrats like Putin, Xi Jinping, Viktor Orban. They note his attacks on democratic allies. They wonder if Trump is deliberately trying to weaken Western unity to benefit authoritarian rivals. We have to be careful here. We're not in the business of conspiracy theories. But we are in the business of analyzing patterns and asking difficult questions. Trump has repeatedly praised Putin. He's questioned whether Ukraine should be independent. He's suggested Russia had legitimate security concerns invading Ukraine. He's called NATO obsolete. Now he's threatening to dismantle the alliance that has contained Russian power for 75 years. Is that coincidence or strategy? European intelligence services are asking the same question, and they're not liking the answers they're coming up with. Let's zoom out even further. Because this isn't just about Europe. This is about the entire global order. Every American ally is watching this crisis. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, the Philippines. They're all asking the same question. If America abandons Europe, will it abandon us too? China is watching very carefully. Xi Jinping is taking notes. If NATO collapses, if America retreats from global commitments, what's to stop China from taking Taiwan? From dominating the South China Sea? From establishing a Chinese-led order in Asia? This is the real stakes of Trump's NATO ultimatum. It's not about defense budgets, it's about whether America remains the world's superpower or cedes that role to rivals.